Hey everyone. Tonight we're diving into something from medieval Europe that's going to make you grateful you weren't born 600 years ago. So get comfortable and let's jump straight into a world where, as a woman, having an opinion could get you locked in wooden stocks for public entertainment. Before you settle in completely, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we're doing here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's talk about something that most people never really think about. So imagine this, you've just woken up in medieval Germany around 1450. The good news, you're alive. The bad news, you're about to discover that arguing with your neighbor is basically a criminal offense. And today, you're going to experience medieval justice firsthand. You step outside to buy bread. Nothing unusual, just another Tuesday in your small German town. The market square is buzzing with people haggling over prices, complaining about quality, doing all the normal things people do when they're trying to get through their day without dying of plague or starvation. At the bread stall, there's drama. The woman ahead of you is arguing with the baker about his ridiculous prices. You've noticed the same thing, actually. The guy's been overcharging everyone for weeks, so when she looks around for support, you nod and add your voice. Nice move? Wrong move. Catastrophically wrong move. Within an hour, someone has reported both of you to the local authorities, your crime being shrewish, which in medieval terms means you had opinions and expressed them loudly enough for people to hear. Apparently, this is disturbing the peace. Who knew that wanting fair bread prices was such a threat to social order? The bailiff shows up at your door with that look that says your day is about to get much, much worse. He explains that you and the other woman need correction for your inappropriate behavior. You try to protest, but medieval justice doesn't really care about your side of the story. They march you back to the market square where a crowd is already forming, because public punishment is basically the only entertainment available in 1450. Your heart sinks as you realize this is really happening. You're about to be publicly humiliated for complaining about bread prices. Enter the shrew's fiddle. This is not a musical instrument, despite what the name suggests. It's a wooden contraption that looks like it was designed by someone who really didn't appreciate women having conversations. Two heavy oak boards connected by iron hinges with holes carved out for necks and wrists, plus a little bell attached because apparently your humiliation needs sound effects. The construction is quite impressive, actually. Local carpenters knew exactly how to build these things. The holes measured to fit different neck sizes, the wood thick enough to be durable because they expected regular use, the hinges oiled so they worked smoothly. Someone put real craftsmanship into this instrument of public embarrassment. They position you and the other woman facing each other, your necks secured in the holes, your wrists locked in place. The wood is rough against your skin. The fit tight enough to hold you, but not tight enough to actually harm you, because that would end the show too quickly. And now you're stuck. You can't turn away from the woman you were arguing with. You can't sit down because the wooden frame won't allow it. You can't scratch that itch developing on your nose because your hands are trapped. Every movement makes the bell jingle, announcing to everyone that the entertainment is ongoing. The crowd is loving this, children pointing and giggling, neighbors shaking their heads with satisfied disapproval, some making comments about how women should know their place, others placing bets on how long you'll last before you start crying. Minutes feel like hours. Your neck cramps immediately because wooden holes weren't designed for human comfort. Your back aches from standing in an awkward position. Your legs shake from staying in one spot. The bell jingles with every breath, drawing more stares and comments. But here's the twisted part. This isn't considered cruel or unusual punishment. This is considered appropriate justice for women who stepped out of line. The community supports it, the authorities endorse it, and probably your own family thinks you brought this on yourself. The shrew's fiddle wasn't some rare torture device used only for extreme cases. It was standard equipment in German and Austrian towns, as common as stocks or pillories. Local officials knew when to use them. Local communities knew what crimes deserved this particular correction. And those crimes? Arguing with neighbors, gossiping about local families, speaking too loudly at market, disagreeing with your husband in public. Basically, anything that suggested you thought your opinions mattered as much as anyone else's. In other words, stuff we'd call Tuesday. Hours pass. The discomfort becomes unbearable, but that's entirely the point. This punishment is designed to be as unpleasant and humiliating as possible, to make you think twice before raising your voice again, to show every other woman in town what happens when you forget your place. The device itself tells us something fascinating about medieval thinking. Women's voices were seen as particularly dangerous to social order, more threatening than men's arguments, more disruptive than male disagreements, something that required special correction, unique forms of control. As you stand there locked in wooden stocks, bells jingling with every movement, you start to understand the real lesson. This isn't about bread prices or fair treatment. This is about power, about who gets to speak and who has to stay silent, about maintaining a social order where women's voices are carefully controlled. What makes this even more interesting is how normal everyone thinks this is. The crowd, the officials, your neighbors, they all see this as perfectly reasonable consequence for stepping out of line. Not an overreaction, not cruel punishment, but exactly what argumentative women deserve. The strangest part might be that it actually worked, not the reconciliation part, but the intimidation part. Women who witnessed these public corrections learned to be more careful about expressing their opinions, more cautious about challenging authority, more aware of the consequences of speaking too boldly. But the shrew's fiddle was just the beginning. As we'll discover tonight, this medieval impulse to silence women didn't disappear when the Middle Ages ended. It evolved, adapted, found new forms, and continued in ways that might surprise you. So let's continue our journey and see what happened next. Now that you've spent what feels like an eternity locked in the shrew's fiddle, bells jingling with every breath, you might think you've experienced the worst that medieval society had to offer, women who dared to speak up. You'd be wrong, dead wrong, because as uncomfortable as those wooden stocks were, they were just the opening act in a much longer, much darker show. You see, the shrew's fiddle was medieval Germany's polite way of handling argumentative women. Little public embarrassment, a few hours of discomfort, and hopefully everyone learned their lesson. But as we move through history, we discover that not everyone was satisfied with such gentle corrections. Some communities decided that silencing women required more permanent solutions. Let's travel a bit further through time and across Europe to discover what happened when societies decided that wooden stocks weren't quite doing the job, when they concluded that women's voices were so dangerous, so threatening to social order, that they needed to be stopped completely. This is where our story takes a much darker turn, where public correction becomes something far more sinister. Welcome to the world of the Scold's Bridle. If you thought the shrew's fiddle was uncomfortable, wait until you meet its more brutal cousin. The Scold's Bridle was a metal cage designed to fit over a woman's entire head, with special attention paid to making sure she couldn't speak, not wouldn't speak, couldn't speak. It was medieval technology, at its most creative and most cruel. Picture this contraption, an iron framework that surrounds your head like a helmet, except this helmet has a very specific purpose. There's a metal plate or spike that goes directly into your mouth, pressing down on your tongue. Some versions had sharp points that would cut your tongue if you tried to move it. Others had a flat plate that just made speaking impossible. The whole thing was locked around your head with a padlock, and the key was held by whoever decided you needed silencing. You're probably wondering what crimes warranted this level of correction. Surely this was reserved for the worst offences, right? Wrong again. Women were sentenced to the Scold's Bridle for the same basic offences that got you locked in the shrew's fiddle, just in communities that had decided gentle correction wasn't working. Gossiping about your neighbours, arguing with your husband in public, complaining about unfair treatment, speaking too loudly at market, disagreeing with local authorities, expressing opinions that men didn't want to hear. In some cases, women were sentenced to wear the bridle simply for nagging, which could mean anything from asking for fair wages to requesting better treatment from their husbands. The process was both simple and horrifying. Once the sentence was pronounced, usually by local magistrates or church officials, the woman would be brought to the town square. The bridle would be fitted over her head, locked in place, and she'd be left to walk around the community for hours or sometimes days, a living example of what happened to women who forgot their place. But here's where it gets really twisted. Unlike the shrew's fiddle, which at least allowed its victims to speak and defend themselves, the scold's bridle made communication impossible. You couldn't explain your side of the story, couldn't apologize, couldn't beg for mercy. You could only endure the stares, the pointing, the comments about how you deserved exactly what you got. The metal was cold against your skin, the weight making your neck ache within minutes. The plate in your mouth made swallowing difficult, breathing uncomfortable. If the bridle had spikes, any attempt to move your tongue resulted in sharp pain. Some versions were designed to make eating nearly impossible, turning the punishment into a form of forced fasting, and the humiliation was total. Everyone who saw you knew exactly why you were wearing the bridle. There was no mistaking it for anything other than punishment for being too outspoken. Children would follow you around, pointing and laughing. Adults would shake their heads and mutter about women who didn't know their place. Your own family might avoid you, embarrassed by the public spectacle. What makes the scold's bridle particularly fascinating from a historical perspective is how widespread it became. These weren't rare devices used only in extreme cases. They were standard equipment in many European towns, as common as any other tool of justice. Local blacksmiths knew how to make them, local officials knew when to use them, and local communities accepted them as perfectly normal responses to female misbehavior. The design variations tell us a lot about how seriously different communities took the problem of talkative women. Some bridles were relatively simple, just metal frameworks with basic mouth restraints. Others were elaborate affairs with decorative elements, spikes arranged in artistic patterns, even bells attached so that the wearer's movements would create sound. Someone put real thought, real craftsmanship into making these instruments of silencing as effective and as humiliating as possible. Regional differences also emerged. English bridles tended to be more utilitarian, focusing on function over form. Scottish versions often included clan symbols or local decorations. German bridles sometimes featured religious imagery, suggesting that silencing argumentative women was seen as holy work. Each community adapted the basic concept to fit their own particular ideas about justice and social control. But perhaps most disturbing was how normal this all seemed to the people living through it. The scold's bridle wasn't viewed as cruel or excessive punishment. It was seen as appropriate correction for women who had stepped outside acceptable boundaries. Communities supported it, families accepted it, and even other women often agreed that their more outspoken neighbors deserved exactly what they got. The effectiveness of these devices wasn't just in the immediate punishment they provided. They served as constant reminders to every woman in the community about the consequences of speaking too freely. Every time someone saw a woman in a bridle, they were reminded that female voices could be dangerous things that needed careful control. And this brings us to a darker realization. The progression from the shrew's fiddle to the scold's bridle wasn't accidental. It represents an escalation, a growing conviction that women's voices posed such serious threats to social order that increasingly severe measures were justified to control them. But even the scold's bridle, as cruel as it was, wouldn't be the end of this story. As you stand there with a metal cage locked around your head, you start to realize something interesting about medieval communities. They were actually quite organized about this whole woman silencing business. The scold's bridle wasn't just random cruelty, it was part of a surprisingly systematic approach to what they saw as social problems. Different regions developed their own styles of bridles, which tells us fascinating things about local attitudes. Scottish versions sometimes included clan symbols, suggesting that family honor was involved in keeping women quiet. English bridles often had decorative elements that made the punishment into a kind of twisted craftsmanship. Someone in Chester made one with such intricate metalwork that it probably took weeks to complete. What's really curious is how they categorized different types of talking problems. Basic gossiping might get you a simple bridle with just a tongue plate. More serious accusations of spreading rumors could result in a version with uncomfortable spikes. And for women who challenged church authority, there were special religious versions that served as both punishment and warning to other potential troublemakers. The whole process was surprisingly formal. Local magistrates would hear complaints, usually from husbands or neighbors, who felt a woman was getting too argumentative. Evidence might include testimony about market disputes or reports of inappropriate language. The accused rarely got much chance to defend herself, partly because defending yourself too vigorously could be seen as proof of the original problem. Once sentenced, the fitting became a public ceremony. The local blacksmith would select the right device, adjust it for size, and lock it in place while crowds watched. The key would be given to her husband or father, symbolically transferring control over her voice to male authority. It was all very official and proper, which somehow made it even stranger. Unlike the shrew's fiddle that kept you in one spot, the bridle was designed for mobility. You were expected to go about your daily business while wearing it. Shopping, attending church, visiting neighbors, all while displaying your punishment for everyone to see. Normal life continued, you just didn't get to participate in the talking parts. The physical aspects were carefully thought out. The weight strained your neck within hours, the mouthpiece made eating tricky and drinking nearly impossible. Speech was completely prevented, but breathing stayed manageable because suffocation would end things too quickly. Some women wore these for days, surviving on liquids they could manage to swallow around the metal. What's particularly interesting is how other women often supported these punishments. Wives would point out neighbors they thought deserved correction. Mothers would threaten daughters with the device if they spoke too boldly. Even women who had experienced it themselves sometimes agreed they had needed the lesson. The church played a big role in making this all seem reasonable. Sermons referenced biblical passages about women's proper silence. Some bridles were blessed by priests before use, turning the silencing into religious ceremony. Sunday services might include prayers for women struggling with excessive talking, reinforcing the idea that female speech needed divine guidance. These devices were expensive to make, requiring skilled metalwork and quality materials. Communities had to budget for them, maintain them, store them properly. The fact that so many towns invested in this equipment tells us how seriously they took the whole female voice situation. Record keeping was surprisingly detailed. Many towns kept logs of who was sentenced, for what offense, and for how long. These records show that usage increased during stressful times, economic difficulties, or religious upheavals. When communities felt threatened, they seemed to focus more on controlling internal dissent, especially from women. The psychological impact reached far beyond immediate victims. Every woman in town knew that speaking too freely could result in days of enforced silence. This created what we might call a chilling effect, where women avoided topics or opinions that might be considered inappropriate. The bridle didn't just silence its victims, it quieted entire communities of women. Some women found creative ways to communicate when speech was impossible. Hand gestures, written messages, meaningful looks became important when voices were locked away. A few bold individuals managed to remove their bridles early, though this usually resulted in even longer sentences. The decline of the scold's bridle came gradually as legal systems evolved and attitudes shifted. But the change wasn't uniform or quick. Some communities kept using these devices well into the 1800s, long after other places had moved on. The last recorded use in Britain was 1856, showing how persistent these ideas could be. As we continue exploring tonight, we'll discover how the thinking behind the bridle didn't disappear when the devices themselves fell out of use. Instead, those ideas evolved and found new expressions in different times and places. The methods changed, but the underlying belief that women's voices needed special management proved remarkably durable. The bridle might have been medieval technology, but the reasoning behind it had a much longer lifespan. Now, you might think that metal cages for talkative women represent the peak of medieval creativity in voice control. But as we move through European history, we discover that some communities decided even bridles weren't quite solving their female speech problems. They needed something more comprehensive, more permanent in its effects. This brings us to an interesting chapter in our story, the period when talking too much stopped being seen as simple misbehavior and started being viewed as something potentially supernatural. The witch trials of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries took all those existing concerns about women's voices and transformed them into something much more serious. The transition makes sense when you think about medieval logic. If women's voices were dangerous enough to require metal restraints, and if some women kept causing problems despite public correction, then maybe the issue wasn't just social misbehavior. Maybe some women were receiving guidance from supernatural sources that required supernatural solutions. The witch hunting manuals that appeared during this period are fascinating historical documents. The Malleus Maleficarum, written in 1487, specifically warned about women who were too talkative, too argumentative, too willing to challenge authority. These behaviors weren't necessarily proof of witchcraft, but they were certainly worth investigating further. What's really interesting is how these manuals took ordinary female behaviors and reframed them as potentially dangerous activities. A woman who knew about herbal remedies might be practicing harmful magic. A woman who was persuasive in arguments might be using supernatural influence. A woman who seemed unusually confident might have supernatural assistance. The investigative process that developed was quite thorough. Suspected individuals were questioned extensively about their beliefs, relationships, and daily activities. Unlike the relatively quick sentencing for bridles or stocks, these investigations could continue for weeks or months while authorities gathered information and made decisions. Many of the silencing tools we've been discussing found new purposes during this period. Bridles were used to prevent accused individuals from speaking spells during questioning. Special restraints were developed to stop them from calling on supernatural allies. The same devices that had been used for social correction became part of a much more serious legal process. The questioning techniques were sophisticated for their time. Sleep deprivation was common, keeping people awake until they became confused and suggestible. Isolation was standard, cutting them off from family and friends who might provide support. The process was designed to break down resistance gradually rather than through immediate force. What made these investigations particularly challenging was how they were structured. Denial could be interpreted as lying, which suggested guilt. Confession obviously indicated guilt. Remaining silent might be seen as supernatural stubbornness, also suggesting guilt. There wasn't really a safe way to respond to accusations, which made the process more about confirming suspicions than discovering truth. This period targeted women who had previously been manageable community problems. The village-wise woman who knew too much about healing. The midwife with strong opinions about childbirth practices. The widow who lived independently without male supervision. Women who might once have faced temporary correction now faced much more serious consequences. The economic aspects created concerning incentives. In many regions, property of convicted individuals was seized by authorities. This meant that targeting wealthy widows or successful businesswomen could be profitable for communities. The woman who had argued about unfair business practices might find herself accused of using supernatural means to achieve success. Professional investigators emerged during this period, traveling between communities with specialized knowledge and equipment. They offered expertise in identifying supernatural threats and conducting proper investigations. Communities could hire them to address local concerns about unusual activities or behaviors. The speed of change was remarkable. Towns that had been content with bridles and stocks for centuries suddenly developed elaborate procedures for investigating supernatural activities. What had been simple social correction became complex legal process with detailed protocols and specialized personnel. The numbers involved were significant. Estimates suggest tens of thousands of people faced these investigations across Europe between 1450 and 1750. with women making up the majority of cases. This represents a massive escalation from the occasional use of correction devices to systematic investigation of female behavior. Communities adapted quickly to these new procedures. Towns that had never conducted such investigations suddenly had regular processes for identifying and addressing supernatural threats. The same social mechanisms that had produced bridles and stocks now produced much more elaborate systems of control. As we continue our journey tonight, we'll see how this represents a crucial turning point in approaches to managing women's voices. What started as temporary correction evolved into permanent solutions, showing how persistent concerns about female speech could escalate when combined with supernatural fears. The interesting thing about this period in European history is how creative communities became in developing new approaches to old problems. The witch investigation process that emerged wasn't just about individual cases, it was about creating comprehensive systems for identifying and managing what they saw as supernatural threats to social order. The tools developed during this time were quite sophisticated. The thumbscrew, for example, was designed with remarkable precision. 2 metal plates connected by adjustable screws that could apply exactly the right amount of pressure to encourage cooperation without causing permanent damage. The craftsmanship involved suggests these weren't crude torture devices but carefully engineered instruments. If you found yourself subject to investigation, the process would begin quite formally. You'd be brought to a special room where various devices sat on wooden tables like tools in a workshop. The investigator would explain very calmly that cooperation would make everything easier for everyone involved. Your comfort level depended entirely on how helpful you chose to be. The questioning was methodical and thorough. Investigators had detailed manuals outlining exactly what to ask and how to interpret responses. They'd want to know about your daily routines, your relationships with neighbors, any unusual knowledge you might possess about healing or other specialized topics. Every answer was carefully recorded by official scribes. What's fascinating is how bureaucratic the whole process became. Everything was documented in legal records that were filed away for future reference. Your statements, your responses to various procedures, your eventual cooperation or lack thereof, all written down in official documents. This wasn't random violence but systematic judicial procedure with proper paperwork. Other techniques were equally systematic. Sleep deprivation involved keeping subjects awake for extended periods until they became confused and more willing to provide the information investigators wanted. The idea was that supernatural influences would be harder to maintain when someone was exhausted and disoriented. Isolation was standard practice, separating accused individuals from family and friends who might provide alternative perspectives on their situation. You'd be told that neighbors had already provided information about your activities, whether this was true or not. The goal was to make you feel alone and encourage cooperation with the investigation. Religious guidance was provided throughout the process. Priests would visit to pray for your soul and explain that cooperation was actually a form of repentance that would be spiritually beneficial. Resistance to the investigation was presented as continued defiance of divine authority, while confession was portrayed as the path to salvation. The evidence standards were quite different from what we'd expect today. A neighbor's livestock getting sick after a dispute with you could be considered significant. A child becoming ill after you disciplined them might suggest supernatural influence. Even positive interactions could be reinterpreted as manipulation or spellcasting. Physical evidence was equally creative. Unusual birthmarks were interpreted as supernatural markings. The inability to produce tears during stressful questioning was seen as evidence of supernatural hardening. Even successful crying could be suspicious if it seemed insufficient or performed rather than genuine. The water test was particularly interesting from a logical perspective. Accused individuals were thrown into deep water to see whether they would float or sink. Floating proved guilt because pure water would supposedly reject a corrupted soul. Sinking proved innocence but often resulted in drowning, making it a somewhat hollow victory for the vindicated. What's most remarkable about this period is how it took existing tools and concerns about women's behavior and scaled them up into something far more comprehensive. Communities that had been satisfied with occasional correction for centuries suddenly developed elaborate systems for investigating supernatural threats to social order. Professional investigators became traveling specialists who moved between communities offering their expertise. They arrived with equipment, legal authority, and detailed knowledge of proper procedures. Towns could hire them to address local concerns about unusual activities or behaviors that might require supernatural explanation. The economics created interesting incentives. Investigators were often compensated based on successful cases, encouraging thorough investigation of any suspicious activities. Property seizure from convicted individuals could be profitable for communities. The costs of investigation were usually charged to families, creating financial pressure for quick resolution. Communities adapted remarkably quickly to these new procedures. Towns that had never conducted such investigations suddenly had regular processes for identifying threats. Children grew up thinking it was normal to have periodic investigations of neighbors for supernatural activities. The same social mechanisms that had once produced simple correction devices now supported much more elaborate systems. Record-keeping from this period shows that investigation activity peaked during times of social stress, economic difficulty, or external threats. When communities felt vulnerable to outside forces, they seemed to focus more intensively on potential internal threats, particularly those involving women who didn't conform to expected behavioral patterns. The geographic spread was impressive. These investigation techniques spread across Europe with remarkable consistency, suggesting active communication between communities about effective methods. Local variations emerged, but the basic framework remained similar from region to region. What's particularly interesting is how normal this all became. Communities that had never experienced such investigations adapted quickly to regular procedures for identifying supernatural threats. The same neighbors who had once reported excessive talking or market disputes now reported suspicious activities that might require supernatural investigation. The decline of these practices came gradually as legal systems evolved and scientific understanding improved. But the transition wasn't uniform across regions. Some communities continued elaborate investigation procedures well into the 18th century, long after other areas had moved to simpler approaches. As we continue exploring tonight, we'll discover how the thinking behind these investigation systems didn't disappear when the formal procedures ended. The underlying belief that women's behavior required special monitoring and control evolved into new forms that adapted to changing times and circumstances. As we've been exploring these medieval and early modern approaches to managing women's voices, you might be thinking that surely by the 1800s, with all their industrial progress and social reform movements, societies had moved past these kinds of systematic control measures. You'd be wrong again. Because as we jump forward a few centuries and travel west to Ireland, we discover that the impulse to silence and control troublesome women didn't disappear. It just got more organized. Welcome to the world of the Magdalene Laundries. Now the name sounds almost peaceful, doesn't it? Laundries suggest useful work, cleanliness, productive activity. Magdalene refers to Mary Magdalene, the biblical figure associated with redemption and second chances. Put them together and you get institutions that sound like they're designed to help women get back on their feet. The reality was quite different. These weren't short-term corrections like the stocks or bridles we've been discussing. The Magdalene Laundries were designed for long-term containment of women who didn't fit into proper social categories. Women who were too independent, too sexual, too argumentative, or simply too inconvenient for their families to handle. Instead of a few hours of public humiliation, we're talking about years or even decades of institutional control. The system that emerged in 19th century Ireland was remarkably comprehensive. Catholic religious orders, working with government approval and family cooperation, created a network of institutions specifically designed to house and reform women who were considered problematic. The language was all about salvation and rehabilitation, but the practice looked suspiciously like the same old impulse to silence female voices that didn't conform to social expectations. If you were a young woman in Ireland around 1900, there were many ways you could end up in a Magdalene laundry. Having a child outside marriage was probably the most common route. But you could also be sent for being too flirtatious, too independent, too argumentative with family members, or simply for asking too many questions about your future. Some women were committed by their own families who saw them as embarrassments or threats to family reputation. The admission process was designed to be permanent. Once you entered a Magdalen Laundry, leaving became extremely difficult. There were no set sentences, no clear criteria for release, no appeals process. Your stay could last months, years, or the rest of your life, depending on how well you adapted to institutional expectations and whether anyone on the outside advocated for your release. Daily life in these institutions was structured around work, prayer, and silence. The laundry work itself was hard physical labor, washing clothes and linens for hospitals, hotels, and private customers. The institutions made money from this work, creating economic incentives to keep women working as long as possible. The longer you stayed, the more profitable you became. But perhaps most relevant to our ongoing story about silencing women's voices, talking was strictly controlled in Magdalen Laundries. Conversations between residents were discouraged or forbidden entirely. Asking questions about the outside world or your legal status was considered inappropriate. Complaining about conditions or treatment was seen as evidence that you hadn't yet learned proper submission and humility. The women who ran these institutions genuinely believed they were providing necessary social services. In their view, they were protecting society from dangerous women while giving those women opportunities for moral reformation. The silence, the work, the institutional control, all of this was presented as therapeutic intervention designed to help women learn proper feminine behavior. What makes the Magdalen Laundries particularly interesting in our exploration tonight is how they represent evolution rather than revolution in approaches to controlling women. The same underlying assumptions that had produced stocks, bridals, and witch investigations were still operating, just adapted to modern institutional forms and religious justification. The scale was unprecedented. While medieval communities might have dealt with one troublesome woman at a time, the Magdalen Laundries could house hundreds of women simultaneously. Ireland's system eventually included dozens of institutions that operated for over 150 years, processing thousands of women through their programs of silence and reformation. The secrecy surrounding these institutions was remarkable. Families often told neighbors that problematic daughters had moved away or married distant relatives. The women inside were cut off from outside communication, unable to tell anyone about their experiences or advocate for better treatment. Society knew these places existed but preferred not to think too carefully about what actually happened inside them. Record keeping was minimal and often deliberately obscured. Unlike the detailed documentation we saw in witch investigations, Magdalen Laundries kept sparse records and often destroyed documents after women died or were released. This wasn't bureaucratic inefficiency, it was intentional obfuscation designed to prevent outside scrutiny of institutional practices. The religious framework provided perfect justification for indefinite containment. These women weren't being punished, they were being saved. The harsh conditions weren't cruelty, they were necessary medicine for moral illness. The enforced silence wasn't oppression, it was spiritual discipline designed to help women develop proper humility and submission. Economic incentives aligned perfectly with institutional goals. The laundry work generated revenue that supported the institutions while keeping women busy and productive. There was no financial pressure to release women quickly or provide them with skills for independent living. The longer they stayed and the harder they worked, the more successfully the institution fulfilled its mission. What's particularly striking is how little resistance these institutions faced from the broader society. The same communities that might have questioned excessive use of stocks or bridals accepted Magdalen Laundries as necessary and beneficial social institutions. The religious authority of the organizations running them provided legitimacy that secular institutions might not have enjoyed. The women inside developed their own forms of resistance and communication despite official restrictions. Secret conversations, hidden messages, informal support networks, all emerging in the spaces between official supervision. But these forms of resistance were necessarily limited and often dangerous for those caught participating. As we continue our journey tonight, we'll see how the Magdalen Laundries represent a crucial transition point in the long history of silencing women. What had once been temporary local corrections became permanent, institutional solutions. The thinking remained the same, but the capacity for implementation expanded dramatically. The industrial age didn't eliminate the impulse to control troublesome women, it just made that control more efficient and systematic. The daily routine in a Magdalen laundry was designed with the same precision we saw in medieval punishment devices, just applied to entire lifestyles instead of individual corrections. You'd wake before dawn to the sound of bells, attend mandatory prayer services, then report to the laundry rooms where you'd spend the next 10 to 12 hours washing, scrubbing, and pressing clothes in hot, humid conditions that would make medieval peasants grateful for their drafty huts. The work itself was deliberately exhausting. Heavy, wet linens, scalding water, caustic soaps that burned your hands raw, and steam that made breathing difficult. But unlike medieval punishments that ended after a few hours, this was your life indefinitely. Week after week, month after month, year after year, of the same routine designed to break down any sense of independence or personal agency you might still possess. The silence rules were particularly sophisticated. You could speak during certain designated times for necessary work communication, but personal conversations were forbidden. Asking about the outside world would earn you extra work assignments or reduced meal portions. Complaining about conditions could result in solitary confinement in small, dark rooms where you'd have plenty of time to contemplate the value of keeping your opinions to yourself. What's fascinating is how the system adapted to different types of problematic women. Those considered sexually immoral got one type of treatment focused on shame and purification. Women who were too intellectually curious received programs designed to redirect their mental energy toward acceptable domestic activities. Those who challenged authority faced intensive sessions on proper submission and the spiritual benefits of obedience. The religious sisters running these institutions weren't cruel by their own standards. They genuinely believed they were saving souls and protecting society from dangerous influences. When they enforced silence, they saw it as spiritual discipline. When they assigned exhausting work, they viewed it as character building. When they prevented outside contact, they considered it necessary protection from corrupting influences. But the economic realities created some interesting contradictions. These institutions needed to be financially sustainable, which meant the laundry work had to be profitable. The more skilled workers became, the more valuable they were to institutional operations. This created incentives to keep the most productive women indefinitely, regardless of their supposed moral reformation. Some women became what we might call institutional lifers. They'd been in the system so long that they'd forgotten how to function in the outside world. They'd developed skills that were only useful within institutional settings, relationships that only existed inside the walls, and identities that were completely tied to their roles as reformed Magdalens. The admission process tells us a lot about how society viewed female independence. A woman could be committed for having strong opinions about her marriage prospects, for refusing arranged marriages, for wanting to work outside traditional female roles, or simply for asking too many questions about why her life had to follow certain prescribed patterns. Independence itself was seen as a form of moral illness requiring institutional cure. Family cooperation was essential to the system's success. Parents, brothers, husbands, and other male relatives had to agree that certain women needed this type of intervention. But families also found the institutions convenient for dealing with daughters who were too expensive to support, too difficult to marry off, or too embarrassing to acknowledge publicly. The legal framework supporting these institutions was remarkably flexible. Unlike criminal justice systems that required specific charges and defined sentences, commitment to Magdalen laundries could be indefinite and based on vague concerns about moral welfare. There were no lawyers involved, no appeals processes, no external oversight of institutional decisions about who should be released and when. Communication with the outside world was carefully controlled. Letters were read by institutional staff and often censored or blocked entirely. Visitors were rare and closely supervised. Phone calls were non-existent. This isolation served multiple purposes, preventing women from organizing resistance, while also ensuring that outsiders didn't learn too much about actual conditions inside the institutions. The psychological impact was carefully calculated. Women were given new names when they entered, symbolically erasing their previous identities. Personal possessions were confiscated and replaced with identical institutional clothing. Individual preferences about food, work assignments, or social interactions were completely ignored in favor of standardized institutional routines. What makes this period particularly significant in our story about silencing women is how it industrialized the process. Medieval communities could only deal with one troublesome woman at a time, using stocks or bridles. Magdalen laundries could process hundreds of women simultaneously, creating economies of scale that made long-term containment financially viable. The institutions also developed sophisticated methods for preventing collective resistance. Women were housed in different sections based on their supposed moral failings, preventing unity between groups. Work assignments were rotated to prevent the formation of stable relationships. Information about the outside world was strictly limited to prevent women from developing realistic plans for independent living. Some women did manage to escape, but the social stigma attached to having been in a Magdalen laundry made reintegration extremely difficult. Employers were reluctant to hire former inmates, landlords wouldn't rent to them, and even families often refused to acknowledge them. Escape often led to destitution, prostitution, or eventual return to institutional care. The success of the Irish system inspired similar institutions in other countries. Australia, Canada, and the United States all developed their own versions of Magdalen-type institutions for dealing with problematic women. The basic model was adapted to local conditions but maintained the same essential features of indefinite containment, enforced silence, and profitable labor. Record-keeping remained deliberately minimal throughout the system's operation. When women died in institutional care, they were often buried in unmarked graves with no notification to families. When they were finally released, they typically received no documentation of their time inside, no job training certificates, no references for future employment. They simply disappeared back into society with gaps in their personal histories that were difficult to explain. The religious framework provided perfect cover for what was essentially a system of female imprisonment without trial. Society could feel good about supporting institutions that were supposedly helping wayward women while remaining willfully ignorant about the reality of permanent silencing and exploitation. The same communities that would have been horrified by public stocks accepted hidden laundries as necessary and beneficial social services. As our exploration continues tonight, we'll see how the Magdalen laundry model represents a crucial evolution in approaches to controlling women's voices. What had once required community cooperation and public spectacle could now be accomplished privately, professionally, and permanently through institutional management. You might think that by the 1940s, with all the advances in psychology, medicine, and human rights awareness, societies would have moved beyond these institutional approaches to managing difficult women. You'd be optimistic, but incorrect. Because as we cross the Atlantic to the United States and move into the mid-20th century, we discover that the medical profession had developed what they considered the most scientific and permanent solution yet to the problem of troublesome female voices. Welcome to the age of the lobotomy. Now, this wasn't presented as punishment or moral correction like the devices and institutions we've been exploring. This was modern medicine, cutting-edge neuroscience, a therapeutic breakthrough that promised to cure mental illness and behavioral problems through precise surgical intervention. The same impulses that had created stocks and laundries now had white coats, medical degrees, and scientific legitimacy. The lobotomy procedure was developed by Portuguese neurologist Antonio Egas Moniz in the 1930s and quickly adopted by American physicians who saw it as a revolutionary treatment for various mental conditions. The basic idea was simple. If you damaged the connections between the frontal lobe and the rest of the brain, you could eliminate troublesome thoughts, emotions, and behaviors that made patients difficult to manage. Dr. Walter Freeman became the leading advocate for lobotomies in America, developing a simplified technique he called the transorbital lobotomy. Instead of drilling holes in the skull, Freeman would insert ice pick-like instruments through the eye socket, above the eyeball, and into the brain. He could perform the procedure in his office in about 10 minutes. making it accessible to families dealing with difficult relatives. If you were a woman in 1940s America exhibiting what your family considered inappropriate behavior, you might find yourself sitting in Dr. Freeman's office while he explained how this simple procedure could solve all your problems. Maybe you'd been too argumentative with your husband, too independent in your thinking, too resistant to traditional female roles, or simply too energetic and opinionated for your family's comfort. The patient selection process reveals fascinating attitudes about acceptable female behavior. Women were recommended for lobotomies for conditions that included depression, anxiety, homosexuality, promiscuity, divorce-seeking, career ambition, and what doctors termed excessive emotionality. Basically, any deviation from quiet, compliant, domestically focused femininity could be diagnosed as mental illness requiring surgical correction. The procedure itself was remarkably casual for something so permanently life-altering. You'd be given local anesthesia or sometimes just electroshock to render you unconscious. Freeman would insert his instruments through your eye socket, sweep them back and forth to sever brain connections, then remove them and send you home with bandages over your eyes and instructions to rest for a few days. The immediate effects were exactly what families had been hoping for. Argumentative women became docile. Independent thinkers lost interest in challenging authority. Sexually active women developed more appropriate moral restraint. Ambitious, career-oriented women discovered newfound satisfaction with domestic activities. The procedure seemed to solve behavioral problems that families and communities had been struggling with for generations, but the long-term consequences were profound. Many lobotomy patients lost the ability to plan for the future, solve complex problems, or experience normal emotional responses. They became childlike in their dependency, requiring constant supervision and care. Their personalities fundamentally changed, often becoming flat, passive, and emotionally disconnected from their previous selves. What makes the lobotomy era particularly relevant to our exploration tonight is how it medicalized the same old impulse to silence difficult women. Instead of acknowledging that some women simply disagreed with social expectations, the medical profession diagnosed their resistance as mental illness requiring surgical cure. The underlying assumption remained the same. Female voices that challenged authority were problems that needed to be eliminated. The most famous case was probably Rosemary Kennedy, sister of future President John F. Kennedy. Born in 1918, Rosemary was intellectually disabled, but also described as increasingly difficult to control as she entered her 20s. She was reportedly interested in men, stayed out late, and challenged her family's attempts to restrict her activities. In 1941, when she was 23, her father arranged for her to receive a lobotomy without telling her mother or siblings. The procedure left Rosemary completely incapacitated. She lost the ability to speak coherently, walk independently, or care for herself. She spent the rest of her life in institutional care, hidden away from the Kennedy family's public life. Her transformation from a challenging but functional young woman to a completely dependent patient illustrates perfectly how lobotomies were used to solve family problems rather than treat genuine medical conditions. The scale of lobotomy operations in America was remarkable. Between 1936 and 1967, approximately 40,000 to 50,000 Americans received lobotomies, with women making up roughly 60% of patients. This wasn't experimental medicine limited to severe cases. It became a standard treatment recommended for a wide range of behavioral and emotional problems that families found inconvenient. The social approval for these procedures was widespread. Medical journals published glowing reports about lobotomy success rates. Popular magazines ran articles about the miracle of surgical personality correction. Families were encouraged to consider the procedure for relatives who were difficult to manage at home or expensive to maintain in institutional care. Insurance companies often covered lobotomy procedures while refusing to pay for long-term psychiatric care or social services. This created economic incentives for families to choose surgical solutions over support services that might have helped women adapt to social expectations without losing their fundamental personalities and cognitive abilities. The medical establishment provided scientific legitimacy for what was essentially the same old practice of eliminating troublesome female voices. Instead of wooden stocks that lasted a few hours or institutional confinement that lasted years, lobotomies offered permanent solutions that required no ongoing community resources or family involvement. Professional medical conferences featured presentations about optimal patient selection for lobotomies, with detailed discussions about which types of female behavior warranted surgical intervention. The language was all about therapeutic goals and patient welfare, but the practical effect was systematic elimination of women who didn't conform to social expectations. What's particularly disturbing is how little follow-up care was provided to lobotomy patients. Families were essentially told that the procedure would solve their problems, then left to deal with the reality of caring for people whose personalities and capabilities had been permanently altered. Many women who had been independent and functional before surgery became lifelong dependents, requiring constant supervision. The decline of lobotomy practice came gradually as psychiatric medications became available and public awareness grew about the procedure's devastating effects. But the transition was slow and uneven. Some physicians continued recommending lobotomies well into the 1970s, particularly for female patients whose families complained about behavioral problems. As we near the end of our journey tonight, we'll see how the lobotomy era represents the culmination of centuries of efforts to silence women's voices through increasingly sophisticated and permanent methods. What started with temporary correction devices evolved into lifetime institutional confinement, then into surgical personality modification that eliminated the capacity for independent thought entirely. The fascinating thing about the lobotomy era is how it created an entire industry around the idea that difficult women were medical problems requiring surgical solutions. Dr. Freeman didn't just perform procedures, he became a traveling evangelist for lobotomy, driving around America in what he called his lobotomobile, demonstrating his technique to medical professionals and families across the country. Freeman's promotional tours were remarkably effective at spreading the lobotomy concept. He'd arrive in a town, rent space at the local hospital, and perform multiple procedures in a single day while teaching local doctors his simplified technique. He treated it like a medical roadshow, complete with before and after photographs showing how argumentative women had been transformed into compliant patients. The speed of these procedures was part of their appeal. Traditional psychiatric treatment could take months or years with uncertain results. Lobotomies promised immediate, permanent solutions to behavioral problems that families had been struggling with for years. A 10-minute procedure could eliminate decades of family conflict over a daughter's independence or a wife's resistance to traditional roles. Patient preparation was minimal, partly because the procedure was presented as routine medical treatment rather than experimental surgery. You might be told you were receiving treatment for depression or anxiety with little explanation about what the procedure actually involved or what the permanent effects might be. Informed consent wasn't really a concept yet, especially for women whose families had already decided they needed medical intervention. The aftermath of lobotomy procedures reveals a lot about social expectations for women during this period. Success was often measured not by the patient's well-being, but by how much easier she became to manage. A woman who stopped arguing with her husband was considered improved, even if she also lost the ability to manage household finances or make independent decisions about her daily activities. Many families found that while lobotomies solved their immediate behavioral problems, they created new challenges around long-term care. Women who had previously been self-sufficient suddenly needed constant supervision. Those who had been financially independent could no longer work or manage money. The procedure often transformed active family members into permanent dependents. The medical literature from this period is particularly revealing about attitudes toward female independence. Research papers discussed optimal patient selection criteria, often focusing on women who were too sexually active, too intellectually curious, too resistant to domestic roles, or too argumentative with male authority figures. These weren't symptoms of mental illness, they were normal variations in female personality that society found inconvenient. Hospital administrators loved lobotomies because they reduced the long-term costs of patient care. Women who had been expensive to maintain in psychiatric facilities became docile enough to discharge to family care or transfer to less expensive institutional settings. The procedure turned complex behavioral problems into simple custodial care situations. The development of outpatient lobotomy techniques made the procedure accessible to middle-class families who couldn't afford expensive psychiatric hospitalization but wanted quick solutions to difficult female relatives. Freeman's office-based approach meant that families could have problematic daughters or wives lobotomized without the social stigma of psychiatric institutionalization. What's particularly striking is how little medical follow-up was considered necessary after lobotomy procedures. Patients were typically seen once or twice to ensure proper healing of the surgical sites, then discharged to family care with minimal ongoing support. The assumption was that successful procedures eliminated the need for continued medical intervention. The geographic spread of lobotomy practice shows how quickly medical innovations could transform social approaches to female behavior. Within a decade of Freeman's first demonstrations, lobotomies were being performed in hospitals across America. Medical schools began teaching the technique as standard neurosurgical procedure, ensuring that new generations of physicians would consider it appropriate treatment. Professional medical organizations initially endorsed lobotomy practice enthusiastically. The American Medical Association published supportive articles about the procedure's benefits. Medical conferences featured presentations about optimal techniques and patient selection criteria. The procedure received scientific legitimacy that earlier methods of controlling female behavior had never achieved. Insurance coverage for lobotomies created economic incentives that shaped treatment decisions. Families who couldn't afford years of psychiatric care or institutional placement could often get approval for surgical procedures that promised permanent solutions. The one-time cost of lobotomy was usually less than the ongoing expenses of managing difficult women through other means. The patient population for lobotomies reveals fascinating patterns about which women were considered problematic enough to require surgical intervention. Single women who refused marriage were common candidates. Wives who sought divorces or challenged their husband's authority frequently received recommendations for the procedure. Women who pursued careers or showed intellectual ambition beyond domestic activities were often diagnosed with conditions requiring lobotomy treatment. Some families used the threat of lobotomy to control female behavior without actually following through with the procedure. The knowledge that surgical personality modification was available and socially acceptable created powerful leverage for enforcing compliance with traditional gender roles. Women who knew they could be lobotomized for excessive independence often became more careful about challenging family expectations. The decline of lobotomy practice began in the 1960s as psychiatric medications became available and public awareness grew about the procedure's devastating effects. But the transition was gradual and uneven. Some physicians continued recommending lobotomies well into the 1970s, particularly for female patients whose behavior problems seemed resistant to other forms of treatment. Legal challenges to involuntary lobotomies emerged slowly as patient rights advocacy developed during the 1960s and 1970s. Families had traditionally been able to authorize surgical procedures for adult daughters or wives without the patient's consent, particularly if the women had been diagnosed with mental illness or behavioral disorders. The lasting impact of the lobotomy era extends beyond the individual women who received the procedures. It demonstrated how medical authority could be used to legitimize the elimination of female voices that challenged social expectations. The same impulses that had created medieval punishment devices and institutional confinement now had scientific credentials and professional endorsement. International adoption of lobotomy techniques shows how quickly ideas about controlling female behavior could spread across cultures. Countries throughout Europe, Asia, and Latin America developed their own lobotomy programs, often targeting women whose behavior challenged local social norms about appropriate femininity. As we approach the conclusion of our journey tonight, we can see how the lobotomy era represents both the peak and the beginning of the end for systematic efforts to silence women's voices through external intervention. The procedure's devastating effects became too obvious to ignore, leading to growing awareness that perhaps the problem wasn't with women who challenged authority, but with societies that couldn't tolerate female independence. As the lobotomy era was ending in the 1970s, you might think that societies had finally learned their lesson about trying to silence women's voices through institutional or medical intervention. You'd be partially correct, but also missing some important developments, because while the crude methods of stocks, laundries, and surgical personality modification were falling out of favor, new approaches were emerging that were more sophisticated, more subtle, and in many ways more pervasive than anything we've encountered so far. The rise of modern psychology and psychiatry created new categories for problematic female behavior. Instead of calling women shrews or morally corrupt, they could now be diagnosed with personality disorders, hysteria, or various forms of mental illness that required professional treatment. The language became more scientific, but the underlying assumption remained remarkably similar to medieval thinking about troublesome women. During the 1960s and 1970s, as women's liberation movements gained momentum, something interesting happened in psychiatric practice. Women who sought independence, pursued careers, or challenged traditional gender roles increasingly found themselves diagnosed with various mental health conditions that supposedly explained their resistance to conventional expectations. The medical establishment had found a new way to pathologize female independence. The development of psychiatric medications created new possibilities for managing difficult women without the obvious brutality of earlier methods. Tranquilizers, antidepressants, and mood stabilizers could modify behavior and personality in ways that were less dramatic than lobotomy, but potentially just as effective at eliminating challenging voices. The pills were voluntary, prescribed by doctors, and taken at home, making the control seem like personal choice rather than external coercion. What's particularly fascinating is how these medical approaches were often presented as liberation for women. Instead of being locked in institutions or subjected to surgical procedures, they could receive treatment that allowed them to function in society while managing their problematic impulses through medication. The same women who might once have faced stocks or bridles could now take pills that made them more compliant and less argumentative. The expansion of therapy culture created new ways to frame female resistance as personal psychological problems rather than reasonable responses to social limitations. Women who complained about inequality could be encouraged to explore their anger issues. Those who sought independence could be helped to understand their fear of commitment or intimacy. The focus shifted from changing society to changing women's attitudes about their place in it. Educational and workplace environments developed increasingly sophisticated methods for managing female voices that challenged authority. Instead of crude exclusion or punishment, institutions created complex systems of evaluation, feedback, and professional development that could effectively silence women while maintaining the appearance of fairness and opportunity. The rise of expert culture meant that women's own perceptions of their experiences became less important than professional interpretations of what those experiences meant. Doctors, therapists, counselors, and other credentialed authorities could override women's understanding of their own lives with scientific explanations about mental health, relationship dynamics, or personal development needs. Legal and bureaucratic systems evolved to handle problematic women through administrative rather than criminal procedures. Child custody evaluations, psychiatric assessments, professional licensing reviews, and other official processes could effectively control women's behavior without the obvious brutality of earlier punishment systems. The threat of losing children, careers, or social standing replaced physical punishment as tools for enforcing compliance. The media industry that emerged during this period developed remarkably effective ways to shape public opinion about appropriate female behavior. Instead of public shaming in town squares, problematic women could be discredited through news coverage, social media campaigns, or professional reputation destruction that accomplish the same silencing effects through modern communication technologies. Consumer culture created new forms of control through economic pressure and social status competition. Women could be encouraged to focus their energy on shopping, appearance, and lifestyle choices rather than challenging political or social systems. The same independence that might once have led to stocks or bridles could be redirected into relatively harmless forms of personal expression through consumer choices. The professionalization of domestic life through parenting experts, relationship counselors, and lifestyle gurus created new authorities who could guide women toward appropriate choices without obvious coercion. Instead of being forced into compliance, women could be educated about optimal approaches to marriage, child-rearing, and personal fulfillment that happened to align perfectly with traditional expectations. What makes this modern period particularly interesting is how it combined the effectiveness of earlier control methods with the appearance of choice and freedom. Women weren't locked in stocks, they chose to take medication, they weren't forced into institutions, they voluntarily entered therapy, they weren't subjected to surgical personality modification, they pursued self-improvement through professional guidance. The development of social media and digital communication technologies created unprecedented opportunities for both silencing and amplifying women's voices. The same platforms that allowed women to organize and advocate for change also enabled new forms of harassment, reputation destruction, and social control that could effectively silence challenging voices without formal institutional intervention. Scientific research began producing studies about gender differences in communication styles, emotional regulation, and social behavior that provided new justifications for treating women's voices as inherently problematic. Instead of calling women shrews, researchers could discuss gender-specific patterns of aggression, assertiveness, and leadership that required different management approaches. Educational institutions developed sophisticated systems for channeling female energy into acceptable outlets while discouraging challenges to authority structures. Instead of crude exclusion, schools could use psychological evaluations, disciplinary procedures, and academic tracking systems to manage problematic students without obvious discrimination. The workplace environment that emerged during this period created complex hierarchies and evaluation systems that could effectively control female behavior through professional rather than personal consequences. Women who challenged authority could face negative performance reviews, limited advancement opportunities, or social isolation that accomplished the same silencing effects as earlier punishment methods. Mental health systems expanded dramatically during this period, creating new categories of illness and treatment that could pathologize female resistance to social expectations. The same independence that might once have led to bridals or lobotomies could now be treated through therapy, medication, or lifestyle counseling that modified behavior while maintaining the appearance of personal choice and professional care. As we move toward the conclusion of our exploration tonight, we can see how the underlying impulse to control women's voices has remained remarkably consistent throughout history, even as the methods have become more sophisticated and socially acceptable. The progression from stocks to pills represents evolution rather than revolution in approaches to managing female independence. The modern era hasn't eliminated the desire to silence challenging women, it has just developed more effective and less obvious ways to accomplish the same goals. What we've discovered in our journey through history is that the problem was never really with the specific devices or institutions used to control women, but with the underlying belief that female voices need to be managed, regulated, and when necessary, eliminated. The arrival of the internet age brought something unprecedented to the long history of silencing women's voices. For the first time, women had access to platforms where they could speak directly to global audiences without requiring permission from traditional gatekeepers like publishers, broadcasters, or institutional authorities. You might think this would have ended the centuries-old pattern of controlling female speech. Instead, it created new battlegrounds and more sophisticated methods of silencing. The early internet seemed like a democratizing force. Women could start blogs, join forums, create websites, and participate in discussions about any topic they found interesting. The barriers to entry were minimal compared to traditional media, and the potential audience was enormous. For a brief moment, it looked like the digital age might finally break the pattern we've been tracing through our journey tonight. But the same technologies that enabled women to speak also enabled new forms of control and harassment. Online platforms quickly developed their own systems for managing problematic voices, often replicating the same patterns we've seen throughout history, but at unprecedented scale and speed. Instead of town squares where individual women could be publicly shamed, the internet created global arenas where thousands of people could participate in silencing campaigns. The phenomenon of online harassment developed sophisticated techniques that would have impressed medieval authorities. Coordinated campaigns could flood women's social media accounts with threatening messages. Personal information could be published to encourage offline harassment, and professional reputations could be destroyed through carefully orchestrated attacks on credibility and character. The goals remained the same as those medieval bridles, to make women stop speaking, but the methods had evolved dramatically. What's particularly interesting is how these modern silencing techniques often masqueraded as grassroots community action rather than institutional control. Instead of official authorities deciding that women needed correction, online mobs could spontaneously emerge to police female behavior. The lack of formal organization made these campaigns seem organic and democratic, even when they accomplished the same silencing effects as historical punishment systems. The rise of social media platforms created new authorities who could control women's voices through algorithmic manipulation rather than obvious censorship. Posts could be buried in feeds, accounts could be shadow banned, and content could be demonetized in ways that effectively silenced women while maintaining the appearance of neutral platform management. The platforms became the new institutional authorities with power to determine whose voices were heard. Professional consequences for online speech created modern versions of the economic pressures that had always been used to control women's behavior. Women could lose jobs, face harassment at work, or have their professional reputations damaged based on their online activities. The threat of economic retaliation provided powerful incentives for self-censorship that accomplished the same goals as historical punishment without requiring formal institutional intervention. The development of doxing techniques allowed online harassers to bridge the gap between digital and physical intimidation. Publishing women's personal information, including addresses, phone numbers, and workplace details, enabled offline harassment that could make women's daily lives unsafe. This created a modern version of the public humiliation that had been central to historical silencing methods. Gaming communities became particularly notorious for developing sophisticated harassment techniques, targeting women who attempted to participate in traditionally male-dominated spaces. The methods included coordinated attacks on streaming channels, manipulation of platform reporting systems, and creation of extensive harassment content designed to make women's participation so unpleasant that they would voluntarily withdraw. The concept of cancel culture emerged as a way to describe coordinated efforts to silence voices through social and professional consequences rather than legal punishment. While the term was often used to describe various types of online criticism, the patterns of targeting women who challenged social expectations remained remarkably consistent with historical approaches to controlling female speech. Dating and relationship platforms created new opportunities for controlling women's behavior through social pressure and reputation management. Women could be punished for being too selective, too independent, or too vocal about their preferences through coordinated negative reviews, harassment campaigns, or manipulation of platform algorithms that affected their ability to form relationships. The rise of influencer culture created new economic models that could incentivize women to self-censor in order to maintain their audience and income. Instead of direct punishment for speaking out, women could face gradual loss of followers, reduced engagement, or algorithm suppression that threatened their livelihood. The economic pressure encouraged compliance with audience expectations rather than authentic self-expression. Educational institutions adapted their traditional approaches to managing problematic students for the digital age. Instead of crude disciplinary measures, schools could monitor social media activity, use online behavior as part of evaluation processes, and create digital portfolios that followed students throughout their academic careers. The same control mechanisms that had always existed in education became more comprehensive and harder to escape. Workplace surveillance technologies enabled employers to monitor women's online activities and use that information to make employment decisions. Social media posts, professional networking activity, and even private communications could become grounds for professional consequences that effectively controlled behavior outside of work hours. The traditional boundary between public and private behavior disappeared in ways that expanded employers' control over women's lives. The development of artificial intelligence and machine learning systems created new possibilities for automated harassment and content manipulation. Deepfake technologies could be used to create compromising content, chatbots could be programmed to harass specific individuals, and algorithmic systems could be manipulated to suppress certain voices while amplifying others. The same technological advances that promised liberation also enabled more sophisticated forms of control. Mental health discourse online created new ways to pathologize women's resistance to social expectations. Instead of calling women hysterical or shrewish, online communities could diagnose personality disorders, suggest therapy needs, or encourage medication for women whose behavior seemed too assertive or independent. The medicalization of female strength continued in digital spaces with the added authority of crowdsourced psychological analysis. Legal systems struggled to adapt to digital harassment, often leaving women with little recourse against online campaigns designed to silence them. The anonymity and international nature of internet communication made traditional legal protections ineffective, while platform policies were often inadequate to address sophisticated harassment techniques. Women found themselves facing the same lack of institutional protection that had characterized earlier historical periods. The speed and scale of digital communication meant that silencing campaigns could be more effective than anything achieved through historical methods. A coordinated online attack could reach thousands of participants within hours, generate massive amounts of harassment content, and create lasting damage to reputations and mental health. The efficiency of digital silencing surpassed anything medieval communities could have imagined. What makes the digital era particularly significant in our historical exploration is how it revealed the persistence of the same underlying attitudes that had created stocks, bridles, and lobotomies. When given new tools and platforms, societies quickly developed ways to use them for the same old purpose of controlling women's voices that challenged authority or social expectations. The promise of digital liberation gave way to the reality of new forms of control that were often more pervasive and harder to escape than their historical predecessors. Women could be silenced not just in their local communities but globally, not just temporarily but permanently through digital records that followed them throughout their lives. As we move into the contemporary era, you might expect that increased awareness of historical injustices would have eliminated the patterns we've been exploring throughout our journey tonight. But what's fascinating is how many of the same underlying dynamics persist, just dressed up in modern language and contemporary justifications that make them harder to recognize but no less effective at controlling women's voices. The rise of wellness culture created new authorities who could guide women toward appropriate behavior through health and lifestyle advice rather than obvious punishment. Instead of being told to be quiet because society demanded it, women could be encouraged to practice mindfulness, reduce stress, and avoid conflict for their own well-being. The same compliance that medieval communities enforced through stocks could now be achieved through yoga classes and meditation apps. Corporate diversity and inclusion programs developed sophisticated systems for managing women's voices in professional environments. Instead of crude exclusion, workplaces could create elaborate feedback processes, leadership development programs, and communication training that subtly discouraged challenging behavior while maintaining the appearance of supporting female advancement. Women learned to modulate their voices and opinions to fit corporate cultures that claimed to value their input. The therapy industry expanded dramatically, creating new categories of relationship problems and personal development needs that often focused on helping women adapt to social expectations rather than challenging unfair systems. Women who complained about inequality could be guided toward exploring their own contribution to relationship dynamics, their communication styles, or their emotional regulation patterns. The focus remained on changing women rather than changing circumstances. Academic institutions developed increasingly complex systems for evaluating and managing student behavior that could effectively silence challenging voices through grade consequences, disciplinary procedures, and professional recommendations. Instead of obvious punishment, problematic students could face subtle but persistent barriers to academic success that encouraged compliance with institutional expectations. The beauty and fashion industries created powerful economic incentives for women to focus their energy and resources on appearance rather than challenging social systems. The same independence that might once have led to punishment could be redirected into relatively harmless forms of self-expression through consumer choices that supported existing economic structures rather than threatening them. Social media algorithms became sophisticated tools for shaping public discourse by controlling which voices were amplified and which were suppressed. Women who challenged certain narratives might find their content receiving less engagement, their accounts experiencing technical problems, or their reach mysteriously declining. The control was invisible but effective, accomplishing the same goals as historical silencing methods without obvious institutional intervention. Dating culture developed complex unwritten rules about appropriate female behavior that could effectively punish women for being too assertive, too independent, or too vocal about their preferences. Instead of formal social sanctions, women faced reduced romantic opportunities, social isolation, or reputation damage that encouraged compliance with traditional expectations about feminine behavior. Professional networking and mentorship systems created new hierarchies where women's advancement depended on their ability to navigate complex social expectations about appropriate ambition, communication styles, and leadership approaches. The same voices that might once have faced bridles could now be marginalized through professional development feedback and career guidance that encouraged more acceptable forms of self-expression. The rise of expert culture meant that women's lived experiences became less important than professional interpretations of what those experiences meant. Doctors, therapists, life coaches, and other credentialed authorities could override women's understanding of their own situations with scientific or therapeutic explanations that encouraged different choices and behaviors. Legal and bureaucratic systems evolved sophisticated methods for managing problematic women through administrative procedures rather than criminal punishment. Child custody evaluations, workplace harassment investigations, professional licensing reviews, and other official processes could effectively control behavior through threats to family relationships, career prospects, or social standing. The mental health awareness movement, while beneficial in many ways, also created new opportunities to pathologize women's resistance to unfair treatment. Instead of calling women difficult or argumentative, problematic behavior could be framed as trauma responses, personality disorders, or emotional regulation issues that required professional intervention rather than social change. Consumer culture and lifestyle marketing became powerful tools for channeling women's energy into acceptable outlets that supported existing economic systems rather than challenging them. The independence that might once have led to punishment could be expressed through shopping choices, home decoration decisions, or lifestyle brands that created the illusion of empowerment without actual power. Educational content and self-help industries developed elaborate systems for teaching women how to succeed within existing systems rather than questioning whether those systems were fair or appropriate. Women could be guided toward better communication strategies, improved emotional intelligence, or enhanced leadership skills that helped them adapt to organizational cultures rather than challenging discriminatory practices. The gig economy and flexible work arrangements created new forms of economic control that could isolate women and make them dependent on platform algorithms and customer ratings for their livelihood. The same independence that traditional employment might have provided could be undermined through economic uncertainty and social isolation that encouraged compliance with customer and platform expectations. Religious and spiritual communities adapted traditional approaches to female behavior for contemporary audiences, using language about biblical womanhood, spiritual submission, or divine design to encourage the same compliance that had been enforced through historical punishment systems. The authority shifted from secular to religious, but the expectations remained remarkably similar. Parenting culture developed complex systems of evaluation and judgment that could effectively control women's behavior through concerns about their children's well-being. Instead of direct punishment, women could face social isolation, professional consequences, or family intervention based on their parenting choices, political activities, or lifestyle decisions. The rise of data collection and behavioral tracking created unprecedented opportunities for monitoring and influencing women's choices through targeted advertising, algorithmic manipulation, and predictive analytics. The same control that had once required obvious institutional intervention could now be achieved through subtle environmental modifications that shaped behavior without conscious awareness. What's particularly striking about contemporary patterns is how they maintain the appearance of choice and freedom while accomplishing the same silencing effects as historical punishment systems. Women aren't forced to be quiet. They choose to modify their behavior to avoid negative consequences. They aren't locked in institutions. They voluntarily enter therapy or coaching programs. They aren't subjected to surgical modification. They pursue self-improvement through professional guidance. The sophistication of modern control methods makes them harder to recognize and resist than their historical predecessors. While medieval stocks were obviously punishment, contemporary feedback systems, algorithm manipulation, and professional development programs can accomplish the same goals while appearing supportive and beneficial. As we approach the conclusion of our exploration tonight, we can see how the fundamental challenge of controlling women's voices has remained constant throughout history, even as the methods have become more subtle and socially acceptable. The progression from crude physical punishment to sophisticated psychological and economic pressure represents refinement rather than elimination of the underlying impulse to silence challenging female voices. Throughout our journey tonight, we've focused primarily on the various methods societies have developed to control women's voices, but there's another side to this story that deserves exploration. For every device, institution, and system designed to silence women, there have been women who found ways to resist, subvert, or overcome these attempts at control. Their strategies reveal just as much about human creativity and determination as the punishment systems themselves. Even in medieval times, women developed subtle forms of resistance to devices like the shrew's fiddle and scold's bridle. Court records show instances of women who managed to remove their restraints early, who used hand gestures and facial expressions to communicate defiance, or who turned their punishment into performance art that mocked the authorities imposing it. Some communities found that public punishment actually increased sympathy for the punished women rather than serving as effective deterrent. The institutional systems we explored, like Magdalen laundries, also faced resistance from the women inside them. Survivors' accounts describe elaborate communication networks that operated despite official silence rules, support systems that helped women maintain their sanity and identity despite institutional pressure, and escape attempts that sometimes succeeded despite heavy surveillance and social barriers to reintegration. During the lobotomy era, some women and their advocates began questioning the medical justifications for surgical personality modification. Early feminist activists, progressive doctors, and family members who witnessed the devastating effects of these procedures started organizing opposition that eventually contributed to the decline of lobotomy practice. The resistance wasn't just individual, it became organized and systematic. The digital age has created unprecedented opportunities for both silencing and amplifying women's voices, but it has also enabled new forms of resistance and collective action. Women have used social media platforms to organize support networks, document harassment patterns, and create alternative spaces for discussion that bypass traditional gatekeepers and authority structures. What's particularly interesting is how women have learned to work within existing systems while gradually changing them from the inside. Instead of direct confrontation that might trigger punishment responses, many women have developed sophisticated strategies for advancing their interests while maintaining the appearance of compliance with social expectations. The rise of women's professional networks, advocacy organizations, and support groups has created institutional alternatives to the traditional systems we've been exploring. Instead of relying on male-dominated institutions for validation and opportunity, women have built parallel structures that provide economic independence, social support, and platforms for authentic self-expression. Legal and political advances have gradually expanded protections for women's voices and reduced the effectiveness of traditional silencing methods. Workplace discrimination laws, domestic violence protections, and civil rights legislation have created formal barriers to some of the institutional control methods that had operated freely in earlier historical periods. Economic independence has proven to be one of the most effective tools for resisting attempts to control women's voices. When women have their own financial resources, they become less vulnerable to family pressure, institutional coercion, and social sanctions that depend on economic dependency for their effectiveness. Educational opportunities have provided women with knowledge, credentials, and social networks that make them harder to silence through traditional methods. When women understand their legal rights, have professional skills, and maintain connections to supportive communities, they become more resilient to attempts at control and more capable of effective resistance. The development of feminist scholarship and women's history has created intellectual frameworks for understanding and challenging the patterns we've been exploring tonight. By documenting the historical persistence of these control methods, researchers have helped contemporary women recognize similar patterns in their own lives and develop more effective responses. International human rights frameworks have provided new language and legal structures for challenging the systematic silencing of women's voices. Global awareness of gender inequality has created pressure on institutions and governments to eliminate practices that might once have been considered normal and acceptable forms of social control. The Internet has enabled women to document and share their experiences in ways that make institutional gaslighting and denial more difficult. When women can record harassment, preserve evidence of discrimination, and share their stories with global audiences, the traditional methods of controlling narrative and silencing victims become less effective. Intergenerational knowledge transfer has allowed women to learn from their mothers' and grandmothers' experiences while developing more sophisticated resistance strategies. Instead of each generation having to discover effective approaches independently, women can build on accumulated wisdom about recognizing and responding to attempts at control. The rise of alternative media and independent publishing has reduced women's dependence on traditional gatekeepers for reaching audiences and sharing their perspectives. Blogs, podcasts, social media platforms, and self-publishing technologies have created new pathways for women's voices that bypass institutional control systems. Professional women's organizations have developed sophisticated strategies for advancing female interests within existing corporate and academic structures. Instead of direct confrontation with discriminatory systems, these organizations focus on gradual change through mentorship, networking, and strategic advancement of women into positions of influence. The expansion of therapeutic and counseling services has provided women with professional support for recognizing and resisting psychological manipulation and emotional control. Modern therapy often focuses on empowerment and boundary setting, rather than the adaptation and compliance that characterized earlier psychological interventions. Legal advocacy organizations have created systematic approaches to challenging discriminatory practices through court cases, policy advocacy, and public education campaigns. These organizations have successfully eliminated many formal barriers to women's participation in public life while continuing to address more subtle forms of discrimination. What's remarkable about contemporary resistance movements is how they've learned to use the same technologies and communication systems that enable modern control methods. Social media platforms that can be used for harassment can also be used for organizing. Data collection systems that enable manipulation can also provide evidence of discrimination. Global communication networks that spread negative narratives can also amplify positive messages. The development of intersectional analysis has helped women recognize how different forms of identity and experience create varying vulnerabilities to silencing methods. This understanding has led to more inclusive resistance strategies that address the particular challenges faced by women of different races, classes, sexual orientations, and cultural backgrounds. Economic entrepreneurship has provided many women with alternatives to traditional employment structures that might limit their voice and independence. Women-owned businesses, cooperative organizations, and alternative economic models have created spaces where women can express themselves authentically without fear of professional retaliation. Educational initiatives focused on media literacy, critical thinking, and historical awareness have helped women recognize manipulation techniques and resist psychological pressure more effectively. Understanding how propaganda, advertising, and social influence operate makes women less vulnerable to subtle forms of control and more capable of independent decision-making. The growth of women's athletic participation and physical fitness culture has provided alternative models of female strength and capability that challenge traditional expectations about feminine weakness and vulnerability. Physical confidence and capability make women harder to intimidate and more willing to defend themselves against various forms of control. As we near the end of our exploration tonight, it's important to recognize that the story of silencing women's voices is not just about oppression and control. It's also about resistance, creativity, and the persistent human drive for authentic self-expression that has never been completely eliminated despite centuries of sophisticated attempts at suppression. As we've traveled through centuries of attempts to control women's voices, from medieval stocks to modern algorithms, certain patterns have emerged that tell us something important about human nature, social organization, and the persistent tension between individual expression and collective control. The consistency of these patterns across different cultures, time periods, and technological contexts suggests that we're dealing with something more fundamental than historical curiosity. One of the most striking patterns we've observed is how each generation has convinced itself that its methods of managing women's voices were more enlightened and humane than those of previous eras. Medieval communities believed that wooden stocks were more civilized than physical violence. Victorian society thought institutional confinement was more progressive than public humiliation. The medical profession presented lobotomies as scientific advancement over crude punishment. Contemporary approaches are marketed as empowerment and choice rather than control and coercion. This progression reveals something fascinating about how societies justify continuing the same basic practices while feeling morally superior to their predecessors. Each era develops new language, new institutions, and new technologies that accomplish similar goals while maintaining the illusion of progress and advancement. The underlying assumption that women's voices need management remains constant even as the methods become more sophisticated. The economic dimensions of these control systems have remained remarkably consistent throughout history. Whether we're talking about medieval craftsmen building stocks, religious orders profiting from laundry work, doctors charging for lobotomies, or modern platforms monetizing user engagement, there have always been financial incentives that support the continuation of these practices. The systematic silencing of women has often been profitable for those implementing it. What's particularly revealing is how these control methods have consistently targeted the same types of female behavior across centuries and cultures. Women who are too independent, too argumentative, too sexual, too intellectual, or too resistant to traditional authority have faced similar responses regardless of whether they lived in medieval Germany, Victorian Ireland, or contemporary America. The specific behaviors that trigger control responses seem to remain constant even as social contexts change dramatically. The role of other women in supporting these systems deserves special attention. Throughout our exploration, we've seen how mothers, sisters, neighbors, and female community members have often participated in identifying and punishing women whose behavior was considered problematic. This pattern suggests that the silencing of women's voices isn't simply imposed by male authority, but is often supported by complex social dynamics that include female participation. The medical and scientific justifications that have evolved over time reveal how institutional authority adapts to maintain legitimacy while pursuing similar goals. When religious justification became less persuasive, medical explanations emerged. When crude medical interventions became unacceptable, psychological theories developed. When obvious discrimination became illegal, algorithmic and bureaucratic methods appeared. The evolution of justification systems shows remarkable creativity in service of consistent objectives. The international consistency of these patterns across different cultures and legal systems suggests that we're dealing with something deeper than local customs or temporary historical circumstances. Similar approaches to controlling women's voices have appeared independently in societies that had minimal contact with each other, indicating that these dynamics might reflect fundamental tensions in human social organization rather than specific cultural developments. The resistance strategies that women have developed also show consistent patterns across time and place. Underground communication networks, alternative economic arrangements, collective organizing, and strategic compliance with surface expectations while pursuing deeper goals have appeared repeatedly in different contexts. The persistence of resistance suggests that the drive for authentic self-expression is as fundamental as the impulse to control it. The role of technology in these dynamics has been consistently complex and contradictory. Each new communication technology has initially appeared to offer liberation and expanded opportunities for women's voices, but has quickly been adapted for control purposes as well. Printing presses, radio, television, telephones, and internet platforms have all followed similar patterns of initial promise, followed by sophisticated control applications. What makes contemporary patterns particularly significant is how they've learned to exploit the language of liberation, empowerment, and choice while accomplishing traditional control objectives. Modern women are rarely told directly to be quiet or compliant. Instead, they're offered professional development, therapeutic intervention, wellness programs, and consumer choices that happen to produce similar behavioral outcomes through voluntary participation. The psychological sophistication of modern control methods represents a quantum leap in effectiveness compared to historical approaches. Understanding of cognitive biases, emotional manipulation, social pressure, and behavioral modification has enabled the development of influence techniques that are far more subtle and harder to resist than crude physical punishment or obvious institutional coercion. The global scale of contemporary systems means that women can face coordinated silencing efforts that span multiple countries, cultures, and institutions simultaneously. The same algorithmic systems, corporate policies, and social media dynamics operate across national boundaries in ways that medieval communities could never have achieved with their local stocks and bridles. The speed of modern communication and decision-making processes means that reputational damage, professional consequences, and social isolation can be imposed almost instantly in response to challenging behavior. The delayed consequences that might have given historical women time to adapt or escape have been eliminated through real-time monitoring and immediate response systems. The documentation and data collection capabilities of modern systems create permanent records that follow women throughout their lives in ways that historical punishment systems could never achieve. A woman who challenged authority in medieval times might face temporary consequences that ended when the immediate crisis passed. Contemporary women face permanent digital records that can affect future opportunities indefinitely. The therapeutic and wellness frameworks that characterize modern approaches have proven particularly effective at encouraging self-modification rather than requiring external enforcement. When women can be convinced that changing their behavior is beneficial for their own health, relationships, and personal development, they become willing participants in their own silencing rather than resistant victims of external control. The complexity of contemporary systems makes them harder to recognize and resist than their historical predecessors. While medieval stocks were obviously punishment, modern feedback systems, professional development programs, and algorithmic content curation can accomplish similar goals while appearing supportive and beneficial to both participants and observers. The institutional support networks that historically provided women with alternatives to mainstream systems have often been co-opted or eliminated in contemporary contexts. Religious communities, extended families, and local support networks that might once have provided protection or alternative perspectives have been weakened or replaced by professional services that operate within the same control frameworks they're supposedly helping women escape. As we prepare for our final reflection, it's worth noting that understanding these patterns doesn't necessarily provide simple solutions or easy answers. The historical persistence and contemporary sophistication of these systems suggest that addressing them requires more than individual awareness or resistance. The challenge of supporting authentic female voices while maintaining social cooperation and stability remains as complex today as it was in medieval times. As we reach the end of our journey through the long history of silencing women's voices, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on what we've discovered and what it might mean for understanding both our past and our present. We began tonight with a curious wooden device from medieval Germany, and we've ended up exploring patterns that span centuries, continents, and cultures with remarkable consistency. The progression from the shrew's fiddle to social media algorithms represents evolution rather than revolution in human approaches to managing voices that challenge existing power structures. While the technologies have become vastly more sophisticated, the underlying impulses and objectives have remained surprisingly constant. Each generation has developed new methods while convincing itself that it had moved beyond the crude approaches of its predecessors. What makes this historical exploration particularly relevant today is how it helps us recognize contemporary patterns that might otherwise seem normal or inevitable. When we understand that the impulse to control women's voices has taken many different forms throughout history, we become better equipped to identify when modern systems accomplish similar goals through more subtle means. The therapeutic and wellness frameworks that characterize many contemporary approaches represent perhaps the most sophisticated development in this long history. Instead of external punishment or obvious coercion, modern systems often encourage women to modify their own behavior for their supposed benefit. This voluntary participation makes contemporary control methods both more effective and harder to recognize than their historical predecessors. The economic dimensions of these systems have provided consistent incentives for their continuation across different eras and contexts. Whether we're talking about medieval craftsmen, religious institutions, medical professionals, or technology companies, there have always been people who benefit financially from systems that manage or silence women's voices. Understanding these economic motivations helps explain why these patterns persist despite social progress in other areas. The role of institutional authority in legitimizing these practices has evolved but never disappeared. Religious authority gave way to medical authority, which has been supplemented by psychological, technological, and bureaucratic authority. Each type of institutional legitimacy has provided justification for continuing similar practices while claiming moral and intellectual superiority over previous approaches. What's perhaps most important to understand is that these historical patterns don't represent conspiracies or deliberate malice in most cases. The people implementing these systems, from medieval magistrates to modern algorithm designers, have typically believed they were solving legitimate problems and providing beneficial services. The persistence of these patterns suggests that they emerge from deeper structural dynamics rather than individual bad intentions. The resistance strategies that women have developed throughout history offer hope and practical guidance for contemporary challenges. The underground networks, alternative institutions, economic independence, and strategic organizing that have appeared repeatedly in different contexts provide models for addressing modern forms of control and silencing. The international and cross-cultural consistency of these patterns suggests that supporting authentic women's voices requires more than changing laws or policies in individual countries. The challenge appears to be fundamental to human social organization and requires systemic approaches that address underlying structural dynamics rather than just surface symptoms. The technological amplification of these historical patterns means that contemporary women face both greater opportunities and greater risks than their predecessors. The same digital platforms that enable global organizing and alternative media also enable sophisticated harassment campaigns and algorithmic manipulation that can silence voices more effectively than any historical method. The speed and scale of modern systems mean that the gradual change strategies that worked in previous eras might not be sufficient for contemporary challenges. The historical record suggests that significant progress often required sustained collective action rather than individual resistance, and contemporary contexts might require even more coordinated responses. The documentation and permanence of modern systems create new challenges that historical women never faced. The ability to maintain permanent records, track behavioral patterns, and coordinate responses across multiple institutions and platforms means that contemporary silencing methods can be more comprehensive and harder to escape than anything achieved through historical approaches. The psychological sophistication of modern influence techniques means that contemporary women need different types of awareness and resistance skills than their historical predecessors. Understanding cognitive biases, emotional manipulation, and behavioral modification becomes essential for maintaining independence in contexts where these techniques are systematically employed. The therapeutic frameworks that characterize many modern approaches require particularly careful analysis because they often provide genuine benefits while also serving control functions. Learning to distinguish between helpful support and subtle manipulation becomes crucial for navigating contemporary systems that blend empowerment and control in complex ways. As we conclude our exploration tonight, perhaps the most important insight is that awareness of these historical patterns doesn't provide simple answers or easy solutions. The challenges of supporting authentic voices while maintaining social cooperation have proven persistent and complex across different eras and contexts. Progress has been gradual and often incomplete, requiring sustained effort rather than quick fixes. The historical record suggests that the most effective responses to these challenges have combined individual awareness and resistance with collective organizing and institutional change. Women who understood their historical context and worked together to create alternative systems achieved more lasting progress than those who relied solely on individual strategies or isolated resistance. Understanding this history can help contemporary women recognize that the challenges they face aren't personal failures or individual problems, but part of long-standing patterns that require collective solutions. The persistence of these dynamics across centuries and cultures suggests that addressing them successfully requires both patience and determination. The creativity and resilience that women have shown throughout this long history provide inspiration for contemporary challenges. Despite centuries of sophisticated attempts at control and silencing, women's voices have never been completely eliminated and have often found unexpected ways to emerge and influence social change. As you settle in for sleep tonight, perhaps you can appreciate both how far we've come from the days of wooden stocks and metal bridles, and also how much work remains to create societies that truly support authentic voices rather than just more sophisticated methods of managing them. The journey from medieval punishment devices to modern influence systems shows both human progress and human persistence in addressing fundamental tensions that continue to shape our social world. The story we've explored tonight isn't finished. It continues to unfold in contemporary contexts with new technologies, new institutions, and new opportunities for both control and liberation. Understanding this history equips us to write better chapters in the ongoing story of human voices seeking authentic expression in complex social systems. And so our exploration ends where it began, with curiosity about human behavior and social patterns that continue to evolve but never completely disappear. The wooden stocks may be museum pieces now, but the underlying questions about voice, power, and social control remain as relevant today as they were in medieval Germany. Good night and sweet dreams.